Massachusetts, 1872, the Finch family estate stood in silence, its shutters nailed shut, gardens strangled by weeds, and windows sealed tight against the world. Neighbors began to whisper of the secrets the Finch family would one day take to their graves. A phrase born of funerals held at dawn, servants dismissed without reason, and strange cries carried on still nights. The Finches, once merchants of standing and pillars of the parish, had become specters in their own home, their legacy of wealth and piety dissolving into something far darker. From the outside, the mansion appeared ordinary for its time, with its high gables, ornamental ironwork, and a carriage drive that curved through a grove of maples. Yet neighbors noted details that disturbed them. Shutters nailed shut even in summer, chimneys that ceased smoking long before winter's end, and a gate that groaned but was never oiled, as though meant to discourage visitors. For a family of such prominence, the silence that hung about their home was unnatural. In a town where gossip moved faster than church bells, no one could ignore the strange stillness of the Finch property. The family had once been admired. Henry Finch, the patriarch, had built the estate in the 1830s after returning from successful ventures in shipping. His descendants inherited both the wealth and the reputation that came with it. They funded local schools, contributed heavily to the parish, and were seen in the front pews each Sunday in fine dress. The Finches presented themselves as pillars of Protestant virtue, a lineage untarnished by scandal. Yet as the decades passed, that carefully polished image began to crack. By 1872, the family consisted of only a handful of surviving members. Illness, sudden deaths, and whispered misfortunes had whittled them down, and those who remained were rarely seen beyond their gates. Townsfolk noted that the once bustling carriages of the Finch estate no longer rolled into the village square. Servants were dismissed or rotated so frequently that their names barely entered the parish records. And those who did serve within the mansion rarely spoke afterward, at least not without trembling glances and lowered voices. One schoolteacher recorded in her diary that she would sometimes see a Finch child staring out from the upper windows, pale and unsmiling, before the curtain was hastily drawn shut. Another villager, a blacksmith, claimed that deliveries of coal were always met at the gate by a stern manservant who insisted the wagons stop short of the house. Every interaction seemed designed to keep outsiders away, to ensure no eyes lingered too long upon the estate's shadowed halls. Inquiries into the family's affairs produced little. Death certificates listed causes so vague, fever, consumption, natural decline, that they raised more questions than answers. Gravestones in the Finch family plot bore initials instead of names, dates instead of epitaphs. The local priest, when pressed, spoke only of private sorrows and God's will before changing the subject. The Finches gave generously to the church, and their privacy was respected, though unease simmered beneath the surface. What unsettled the townspeople most was not what they saw, but what they heard. On still nights, travelers on the road swore they caught the echo of cries from the upper floors, muffled and fleeting. Others reported the sound of shutters banging, though no wind stirred. And then there was the smell, an acrid scent of medicine and burning oils that drifted over the hedges, carried on the breeze. It was said that once, during the summer of 1871, a visitor approaching the estate was overcome by the sharp, chemical odor and turned away, declaring that a house of sickness lay beyond those gates. The mystery deepened when the last generation of Finches began to die in quick succession. Lydia Finch, the matriarch, passed suddenly in late 1871, her death attributed to weak nerves. Within months, 2 of her children followed, and then an uncle. Each was buried swiftly, with little ceremony. By the following winter, the household was reduced to only a handful of surviving kin, their faces unseen by the village, their presence acknowledged only by the occasional flicker of a candle in the window. Local newspapers mentioned the family only in passing, noting their contributions to the parish fund or the quiet burials in the churchyard. No scandal was printed, no accusations made. Yet everyone knew something was amiss. No family lost so many members in so short a time without questions being asked. And yet the questions were asked only in hushed tones, for no one dared confront the Finches directly. What little testimony survives from servants suggests a household consumed by secrecy. One maid, years later, recalled being forbidden to enter certain rooms, even when ordered to clean. Another mentioned that portraits of the Finch ancestors had been covered with black cloth, though no mourning period was publicly declared. The house itself seemed to mirror its occupants, shuttered, concealed, suffocating under the weight of something unspoken. By the time the last Finch was lowered into the family plot in 1872, whatever secrets they guarded were buried with them. The estate was sealed, its windows nailed shut, and for decades it stood untouched, a decaying monument to silence. Neighbors avoided its gates, claiming that even the birds refused to roost in its trees. The Finches had once stood as symbols of prosperity and respectability, but in death, they became something else entirely. A cautionary tale, a whispered name, a reminder that wealth could not shield a family from the shadows within their own walls. Thus began the legend of Secrets the Finch family took to their graves, 1872. It is not the tale of a single crime, but of many hidden truths, some perhaps mundane, others unspeakable, that together formed a shroud of mystery. And like the shutters nailed across the windows, those secrets remain fastened still, leaving us to peer through the cracks and wonder what lay hidden in the darkened rooms of the Finch estate. The Finch name carried weight long before the mansion, with shuttered windows, became a local landmark of dread. The family traced its lineage to the early colonial period, when Elias Finch arrived from England with little more than a Bible, a ledger, and a determination to plant his name firmly in New England soil. By the late 18th century, the Finches had become merchants of influence, moving goods between Boston and the inland townships. Their Puritan roots colored every aspect of their public life: discipline in business, devotion in the parish, and a sense of superiority that set them apart from neighbors of lesser standing. In town records, their names appear beside donations to schools, church repairs, and almshouses, as though the family wished to write their virtue into the very fabric of the community. Yet, behind the neat handwriting of the parish ledgers, another story flickered in margins and whispered recollections. Family Bibles contained corrections and scratched-out entries, suggesting that births, marriages, and deaths did not always proceed in orderly fashion. One document notes a marriage annulled after only 3 months. Another describes a son unfit for inheritance, without explanation. When seen in isolation, these could be dismissed as the common tragedies of any family. But when gathered together, they form a pattern of instability running through generations. The Finches projected piety. They occupied the front pews of the meeting house, recited prayers with the solemnity of saints, and spoke often of discipline. But discipline within the household often tipped into severity. Diaries from neighbors mention Finch children whipped for the smallest of missteps, daughters sent away suddenly to finish their education, only never to return. A reverend writing in 1839 remarked privately that he worried for the family's inflexible devotion to appearances, noting that confession of sin was never part of their practice, only the denial of it. Henry Finch, who built the great estate in the 1830s, embodied this duality. Outwardly, he was a benefactor, endowing the local school with books and hiring tutors to instruct poorer children in scripture. Inwardly, correspondence suggests a man consumed by suspicion and control. Surviving letters to his siblings are curt, demanding exact accounts of money borrowed or land leased. His will, preserved in the county courthouse, is a document of both generosity and cruelty. Generous to the church, but ruthless toward his own kin. A brother is cut off with the phrase, "for want of discipline," while a daughter is bequeathed only a Bible, no property, no coin. Inheritance disputes followed every generation of the family. Court papers from the 1840s reveal suits brought by nephews and cousins who claimed they were promised land or dowries never delivered. The judges consistently ruled in favor of the Finch patriarchs, who arrived in court with meticulous ledgers and witnesses drawn from their own circle. These victories cemented their dominance, but also sowed bitterness. It is said that one disinherited cousin, Jacob Finch, declared outside the courthouse that the family's wealth was purchased with blood and deceit, and that one day their walls would fall in upon them. His words, recorded in a bystander's recollection, became a refrain repeated long after his death. The family's reputation for discipline could not shield it from whispers of decline. Marriages often failed in scandal or silence. One daughter, Anne Finch, married a man from Providence who was rumored to drink heavily. Within a year, she returned to her father's house and lived out her days behind closed curtains. Another son, Matthew, vanished from records entirely after 1856, save for a fleeting note in a ledger that he was lost to reason. The phrasing suggested madness, though whether from illness, despair, or something darker, no one could say. By mid-century, the Finches were less frequently seen in the public square. While their contributions to parish and charity continued, their personal presence diminished. Henry grew old and reclusive, and his heirs seemed determined to maintain distance from the community that once celebrated them. It was said that they took meals together, but spoke little, each retreating afterward to separate rooms. Servants who stayed longer than a season described the house as one of rigid routine, where prayers were said in hushed voices and laughter was nearly forbidden. Still, the veneer of respectability held. The Finch name carried enough prestige to silence uncomfortable questions. When a young Finch woman died at only 21, the obituary simply read, "After a brief illness." When another passed in middle age, the church bells tolled, the town bowed its head, and no one asked why her grave bore only initials. The family's donations ensured that silence was rewarded. Yet, the records do not lie. They hint at a lineage troubled by more than the ordinary trials of life. Inheritance stripped from some, marriages dissolved without reason, and heirs lost to madness or disappearance. These details fracture the image of the Finch family as pious exemplars. Their decline was not sudden, but gradual, concealed by the careful maintenance of reputation. Like their shuttered windows, the outward face hid the shadows within. By the time the final Finches withdrew behind the nailed curtains of 1872, their legacy was already split in two. The official record of merchants and benefactors, and the whispered tales of cruelty, secrecy, and decline. To the town, they remained both a source of pride and a cautionary tale. A family who built their name upon discipline and faith, only to be consumed by the very shadows they sought to deny. Their reputation, like their estate, stood tall but hollow, waiting for the inevitable collapse. Parish records are often the most reliable testimony a town can leave behind: births, marriages, and deaths, all neatly inscribed in ink, meant to outlast memory. Yet, when the Finch family of Massachusetts entered those ledgers in the 19th century, their entries stood apart. By 1872, the church register that should have told a clear story of their lineage instead revealed unsettling gaps and cryptic notations. It was here, in the brittle pages of parish documents, that whispers of the Finch family's decline first found permanence. Burials are usually the most public of all rituals, marked by tolling bells, somber processions, and epitaphs carved in stone. But the Finch deaths recorded in the parish book tell another tale. Beginning in the late 1860s, entries appear in quick succession: Mrs. L. Finch, buried; infant son of E. Finch, interred; H. Finch, elder, committed. These lines, spare and abrupt, lack the customary flourishes of consolation or scripture. Even more unusual, several of the burials are marked with initials only, the full names withheld or deliberately erased. Such omissions were rare in any New England parish, rarer still among families of prominence. Clergy at the time seemed reluctant to provide explanations. The Reverend Samuel Pratt, who presided over the Finch parish in those years, kept his own private journal alongside the official records. Surviving excerpts hint at unease. Another Finch laid to rest. Family insisted no procession, only the earth and stone. Their coin is heavy upon this parish, yet I fear their secrets weigh heavier. These words, never intended for public view, suggest a conflict between duty and conscience. While the church was expected to honor the wishes of its most generous patrons, the priest himself sensed that something unnatural lingered behind their demands. Neighbors noticed the irregularities as well. In a community where funerals often filled the churchyard with mourners, the Finch burials were oddly quiet affairs. Coffins were carried at dawn or dusk, with only a handful of servants in attendance. Bells that should have tolled remained silent. The cemetery plot that belonged to the family grew crowded in a matter of years, yet the gravestones bore little to distinguish them. Some displayed only initials LF, MF, HF, as if to conceal the identities of those within. Others carried no inscription at all, just cold slabs of stone. The parish council raised quiet questions, but they did not last long. For decades, the Finches had been benefactors of the church, their wealth underwriting renovations, repairs, and the construction of a new vestry hall. When suspicions arose, generous donations soon followed. Records show a sizable gift of timber for the church roof in 1870, followed by coin for hymnals the year after. It is easy to see how such gestures silenced inquiry. Few ministers could afford to alienate their wealthiest congregants, and Reverend Pratt himself was often criticized for leniency when dealing with the Finches. Yet he may have been trapped by the same bargain that held the entire parish accept their gifts, and in return, avert your eyes. Over time, the whispers grew louder. Mothers told their children not to linger near the Finch crypt after dark. Parishioners who attended services recalled the family entering through side doors, avoiding the gaze of others. One recalled how, on a bitter December morning, a Finch funeral arrived unannounced. No bells, no procession, only a wagon carrying a simple pine box. The coffin was lowered into the earth before the town had even risen from their breakfasts. Later, the parish book recorded merely, "Burial conducted cause unspecified." Irregularities extended beyond burials. Baptismal records list children whose names never appeared again, either in school rolls or marriage ledgers. It was as if some were erased from the town's memory altogether. One entry notes, "A daughter, christened AF," but no marriage or death record follows. Another child is baptized, only for the corresponding burial record to appear months later with nothing more than the initials IF. The secrecy surrounding these lives suggested either shame or concealment, perhaps both. Church politics ensured the silence endured. As long as the Finch contributions flowed, few dared to confront the family directly. Parish councils turned their attention to less dangerous matters, such as hymn choices or the painting of pews. When a young curate once attempted to question why the family insisted on closed-door ceremonies, his superior cautioned him sternly. The Finches are not to be pressed. Their grief is theirs to bear. Yet the curate later confided to a colleague that he had seen bruises on the wrists of one Finch daughter at her funeral, concealed under lace gloves. The ledgers themselves became artifacts of the family's secrecy. Whole pages in the 1871 book are water-stained, the ink blurred, as if deliberately tampered with. Margins that once bore neat notes of hymns sung or verses read are left blank. The usual flourishes of script, recording a life with dignity, are absent. Instead, the entries appear rushed, almost ashamed, as if the act of writing them carried a weight the priest wished to lay down quickly. By the winter of 1872, when the shutters of the Finch estate were nailed closed for the final time, the parish records had already written the family into a kind of silence. Their wealth had preserved their reputation in public, but the documents told another story of burials without bells, of initials instead of names, of a household determined to hide its dead as much as its living. For those who sought the truth, the church books became both evidence and accusation, proof that what lay inside the Finch mansion was not merely private sorrow, but something darker, something the parish itself had been compelled to bury alongside them. Thus, the whispers in the parish records endure. They are not confessions shouted from rooftops, but faint scratches of ink, revealing more by what they omit than what they say. And through them, we see the outlines of a family that tried to purchase silence, yet left behind traces too peculiar to erase. In the ledgers of the church, the secrets of the Finch family still breathe, waiting for those willing to read between the lines. The first true crack in the Finch family facade came with the sudden death of Lydia Finch, the matriarch who had presided over the household with a mixture of severity and grace. Her passing in late 1871 was recorded simply in the parish book as heart failure, an explanation so common and so vague that it raised no public alarm at the time. But within weeks, fragments of testimony began to circulate, snatches of rumor from servants, hushed observations from neighbors that suggested her death was neither ordinary nor peaceful. In the years that followed, Lydia's demise became the fulcrum upon which the entire mystery of the Finch family seemed to turn. Lydia was a woman of formidable presence. Born into a respectable merchant family of her own, she married Henry Finch in the 1830s, bringing both dowry and social connections that elevated the household further. Townspeople remembered her as tall and stern, with a voice that carried across the church nave and eyes that brooked no nonsense. She was known to enforce discipline within her home as fiercely as her husband enforced it in business. For decades, she appeared unshakable, the figure who held together a family prone to quarrels and decline. That such a woman should collapse suddenly into death struck many as strange. According to official record, Lydia died in her bed, attended by her eldest daughter and a servant. The physician, Dr. Horace Willoughby, wrote failure of the heart on the certificate, the phrase he had employed for several other Finch deaths over the years. But those who were present told a different story. One servant, dismissed shortly afterward, confided that she had found marks on Lydia's wrists, faint bruises, as though she had been restrained. Another spoke of the sharp, medicinal odor that clung to the room, the unmistakable scent of laudanum. Laudanum, a tincture of opium, was common in Victorian households, prescribed for everything from sleeplessness to anxiety. But in excess, it was lethal. The servant recalled bottles on the nightstand, some empty, others half spilled, as though used in haste. Neighbors, too, had heard unsettling signs in the weeks before her death. Several recalled hearing cries carried on the night wind, long, anguished wails that seemed to come from the upper windows of the Finch estate. One farmer swore that on 3 occasions, as he returned from tending livestock after dusk, he heard a woman's voice shouting words he could not make out, followed by a sudden silence. Another neighbor, a widow who lived within sight of the mansion, testified years later that she heard the sound of a struggle furniture scraping, something heavy falling before the cries ceased altogether. None of them dared to approach the house at the time. The Finch reputation for privacy was strong, and few were willing to risk confrontation. The closed-door funeral that followed only deepened suspicion. Lydia's body was removed from the house at dawn, borne in a carriage directly to the family plot without a procession. The church bells remained still. Even the priest, Reverend Pratt, seemed unsettled by the secrecy, noting only in his private journal, "This morning buried Mrs. Lydia Finch. No hymn, no congregation, no words of comfort." Family insisted upon silence. For a woman of her stature, this was not only unusual, it was unthinkable. The more people talked, the stranger the details became. Some insisted Lydia had been ill for weeks, her once commanding voice reduced to whispers, her strong posture bent with exhaustion. Others claimed they saw her at a window days before her death, gesturing wildly as though signaling for help, before being pulled back by unseen hands. And always, the stories returned to the smell of medicine, the chemical tang that seemed to seep from the Finch home during her final weeks. The physician remained silent. Dr. Willoughby had long been the family's medical attendant, and though his private ledger hinted at doubts, he never spoke them aloud. To the town, he simply repeated the official line, heart failure, nothing more. Yet in his notes, later discovered among his papers, he scribbled, "Unusual discoloration of lips, constriction at wrists, family forbids examination." These words, hastily written, suggest that even he suspected Lydia's death was not natural. Whether he was threatened, bribed, or simply complicit, no one could say. After her burial, the house grew darker still. Lydia's absence left a void that nothing filled. She had been the anchor of the family, the figure who upheld appearances even as shadows gathered. Without her, the remaining Finches seemed to drift further into secrecy. Shutters were nailed shut more tightly, curtains drawn even in daylight. Servants were dismissed in greater numbers, and those who remained were confined to their duties, forbidden to speak of what they witnessed. It was as though Lydia's death had released something within the household, an unraveling that could no longer be contained. Rumors spread through the village, fueled by fear and fascination. Some believed Lydia had taken her own life, driven by despair at the family's decline. Others whispered she had been poisoned, perhaps by one of her children eager to seize control of the estate. Still others clung to darker stories that she had been the keeper of a family secret too dangerous to reveal, silenced when she threatened to speak. Whatever the truth, her sudden end marked the beginning of the family's final descent. The gravestone in the parish yard offers little clarity. It bears only her initials, LF, and the year of her death. No epitaph, no verse of scripture, nothing to commemorate her life of discipline and devotion. The omission was striking enough that townspeople remarked upon it for years. For a family so concerned with appearances, why erase even her name? Was it shame, secrecy, or something more sinister? Lydia Finch's death remains the first in a chain of events that sealed the family's fate. Though the official record speaks of heart failure, the whispers of servants and neighbors tell another story of screams in the night, of restraints, of laudanum's bitter scent. It was the first suspicious death within the shuttered mansion, and it set the pattern for all that followed. From that winter forward, the town no longer looked upon the Finch estate as a house of piety and discipline, but as a place where life and death mingled under a veil of secrecy. Lydia's silence, forced or chosen, became the silence of the entire family, a silence that carried them all to their graves. When outsiders spoke of the Finch estate in 1872, they did not dwell on its gardens or its grandeur, but on its doors closed, locked, and barred from view. Visitors who had occasion to cross its threshold described not the warmth of hospitality, but the strange absence of life in entire wings of the mansion. Long corridors stood in shadow, rooms sealed with heavy locks, and windows nailed so tightly that no air or light could intrude. It was as though the Finches, once determined to display their wealth and piety, had turned instead to hiding something within their walls. The house became less a home and more a fortress, a place where secrets were stored behind wood and iron. Accounts from tradesmen and deliverymen survive in fragments, and though they were often reluctant to speak, their details are chillingly consistent. One mason recalled being hired to repair cracks along the eastern wing, only to find every window shuttered from within and nailed fast. Curtains hung thick over the glass, so dust-caked they seemed part of the wall itself. "I thought the wing abandoned," he later confessed, "until I heard a sound, faint and muffled, like a child's cough from behind the boards." He was told firmly by the steward that no entry was permitted, his tools collected, and wages pressed into his hand before he could ask further questions. A seamstress, summoned to fit garments for one of the Finch daughters, recalled being led only to the drawing room and forbidden from wandering. Yet she swore that as she waited, she glimpsed down a corridor where several doors stood chained across, as if to contain something rather than keep intruders out. She described the air in that part of the house as stifling, like a cellar where no fresh breath has passed for years. When she asked casually why those rooms were closed, her escort merely replied, "The family does not use them." Rumors soon began to circulate among the villagers about what lay behind those locked doors. Some whispered that the Finches had children too frail for the outside world, delicate, as the family phrased it, kept indoors under constant watch. Others believed there were sickly relations hidden from view, their illnesses concealed to preserve the family's reputation. One of the bolder tales claimed that an entire wing of the house was reserved for those who had lost their reason, shut away to keep their cries from disturbing the household. Whether these stories were true or not, they gained power from the silence of the Finches themselves. No denials were ever offered, no explanations given. Instead, More shutters were nailed closed, more corridors sealed, and the sense of suffocation grew. Even the servants who worked within the mansion admitted to knowing little of what lay in the locked sections. Some said they were given keys only to certain halls and ordered never to touch others. One maid, dismissed for speaking out of turn, described the sensation of walking past those doors at night, hearing faint shuffles and whispers within. It was like the house breathed through its locked rooms, she told her sister years later. The Gothic atmosphere of the estate was undeniable. Visitors often remarked on how the corridors seemed to twist back upon themselves, doors leading to other doors, some opening only into brick walls where passageways had been sealed. In one account, a carpenter claimed to have repaired a door in the west wing that, when opened, revealed only another locked door a few feet beyond, as though the mansion had grown layers of secrecy over time. Such details contributed to the impression that the Finches were not merely preserving privacy, but building a labyrinth of concealment. Neighbors grew uneasy at the sight of windows darkened, even on the brightest summer afternoons. Children, daring each other, would creep along the hedgerows and throw pebbles at the shuttered panes, hoping for a sign of life. Some swore they saw figures move in the gloom behind the curtains, pale faces that vanished when glimpsed. Others spoke of faint tapping sounds that came from inside, as if someone confined within was trying to signal the outside world. The stories varied, but all carried the same theme. The Finch house was not empty, but it was not free either. Locked corridors became part of the household's reputation. Guests invited to supper, rare, though they were found, their movements carefully managed. They were shown into the dining room, the parlor, and the drawing room, but never beyond. Doors remained closed, even as servants hurried through them, carrying trays or linens without a word. When asked why certain wings were sealed, the Finch hosts responded with vague statements about repairs, or storage, or rooms not in use. Yet no repairs were ever seen, and no storage was ever carried in. The more the house closed itself off, the more the town speculated. Some believed the Finches were concealing illness, madness, or deformity. Others whispered of stranger things, rituals conducted in private chambers, experiments hidden from the world. The locked rooms became symbols, representing the secrecy that enshrouded the family. Every nailed window, every chained door, was proof that the Finches were guarding something they dared not allow daylight to touch. By the final winter of 1872, when Lydia Finch was already in her grave, the estate had become a house of locked silence. Neighbors passing by after dark saw only a single candle burning in the front hall, while the rest of the mansion loomed in shadow. Entire wings seemed dead, and yet rumors persisted that voices could be heard from within. The Finch house stood as a monument to concealment, its corridors shuttered against truth, its doors guarding secrets that no servant, neighbor, or priest would ever fully reveal. The locked rooms were more than physical barriers. They were the architecture of denial, each nailed window and chained corridor, a reflection of the family's determination to bury their troubles alive. And in the end, like the Finches themselves, those rooms remained sealed, silent witnesses to whatever transpired within, their secrets carried to the grave, alongside the family that built them. Long after the Finch estate had fallen silent, the most enduring memories among the villagers were not of the patriarch Henry or the matriarch Lydia, but of the children, the pale figures glimpsed behind curtains, the fleeting silhouettes at shuttered windows. Testimonies collected decades later painted a picture of a generation raised in secrecy, their lives confined within the mansion's darkened halls. These children, if indeed they were as numerous as whispered, seemed to exist more as phantoms than as living members of the community. Neighbors recalled seeing faces pressed against the glass, wan and expressionless, before vanishing when spotted. A farmer's wife, whose fields bordered the estate, swore she often saw small hands part the curtains for only a moment, revealing the outline of a child too pale for the summer Sunday. "They looked at us like they wanted to come out," she told her grandchildren years later, "but then someone would pull them back and the window would close." These recollections, though secondhand by the time they were recorded, repeated a consistent image. Children were present in the Finch home, yet never present in the town. The absence of those young voices outdoors was striking in a community where children played openly in streets and fields. In the village square, where other families gathered on Sundays, the Finch offspring were conspicuously absent. No one recalled them at lessons in the parish school, nor among the lines of children at the harvest festival, nor in the choir loft, where youthful voices usually rang clear. Instead, the Finch heirs were said to be instructed by private tutors, figures who came and went quietly, often under cover of early morning or late evening. One elderly tutor, interviewed long after the family had died out, admitted he was paid handsomely to educate a small number of children inside the mansion, but he was never permitted to enter certain rooms and was dismissed when he asked questions about missing pupils. The parish census deepened the mystery. Between 1855 and 1872, the records list varying numbers of Finch children, sometimes as many as 6, other times only 3. Births appear without corresponding baptisms. Baptisms appear without subsequent mentions in school rolls or marriage bans. Even more troubling, deaths of children are rarely recorded at all, despite the evidence of infant graves in the family plot. On one census sheet from 1864, the parish clerk scratched out 2 names and replaced them with initials, as if instructed to obscure identities. When asked about the discrepancy, Reverend Pratt is said to have shrugged and replied, "The Finches account for their own." Such evasions invited speculation. Some villagers believed the family concealed children born with frailties, illnesses, deformities, or minds deemed unfit for the world. Others whispered that certain births resulted from liaisons too scandalous to acknowledge, offspring hidden in locked rooms rather than shamed in public. The inconsistency of records seemed to confirm these fears. For every child who appeared briefly in the parish books, another seemed to vanish without trace. It was as though the Finch estate had absorbed them, erasing their presence from the outside world. One woman, a washerwoman who worked briefly for the household, later recounted that she once carried linens up to a nursery where 3 children played. They were thin, pale, and quiet, staring at her without speaking. When she returned the following week, the nursery was locked, the windows shuttered, and no trace of those children remained. She asked a fellow servant what had become of them, only to be told curtly, "There are no children in this house." The denial was so absolute that she never returned, convinced she had stumbled upon something she was not meant to see. Even the graveyard bore signs of concealment. Alongside the larger Finch headstones stood several small markers, uncarved and anonymous. Local lore held that these were the resting places of Finch children who had died in infancy, though no parish entry confirmed it. A gravedigger, when pressed in old age, admitted he had been ordered to dig small graves at night, without ceremony, without bells. He remembered coffins so small he could carry them alone, but he was never told the names of those laid to rest. "They said it was none of my concern," he muttered, "but I never forgot how light they were." By the early 1870s, whispers had grown into certainty among the townsfolk. Some Finch children were born, some were raised in shadow, and some simply vanished. No one could say how many had lived behind those nailed windows, or how many were buried without record. What they could say was that the Finches seemed determined to erase half their lineage, to blot out inconvenient lives as if they had never existed. The image of children in shadows became one of the most enduring aspects of the Finch legend. Pale faces behind curtains, initials scratched in parish books, unmarked graves in the churchyard. These fragments formed a portrait of secrecy and sorrow. The family may have sought to shield their reputation, but in doing so, they left a legacy more haunting than scandal alone. For while adults can conspire and conceal, the image of a child staring longingly from a locked window is something no community forgets. Thus, the Finch heirs passed through their short lives unseen, their laughter absent from the fields, their names missing from the records, their presence reduced to whispers at the edge of memory. They were children in shadows, kept within the labyrinth of locked rooms, their stories swallowed by the silence that defined the family. And like the rest of the Finches, whatever truths they carried were taken with them to the grave. Every great family has its physician, and for the Finches, that role fell to Dr. Horace Willoughby. He had been trained in Boston, returning to Massachusetts in the 1840s with a respectable practice and a reputation for discretion. By the 1860s, he had become the Finch household's most trusted confidant, summoned for births, illnesses, and deaths alike. His name appears again and again on the official records that survive. Death certificates signed in a careful hand. Each sighting causes so ordinary they drew little attention: consumption, fever, heart failure. For decades, his pen preserved the family's outward respectability. But long after his own death, when his private ledger was discovered among dusty boxes in an attic, a different story emerged. One that revealed the Finch secrets more plainly than any parish record or whispered testimony. The ledger, bound in worn leather, was not meant for public eyes. It contained notes written in a hurried, sometimes trembling script, as though the doctor feared even to record what he had seen. Amid the careful entries of tonics prescribed and ailments observed were lines that jarred the reader: unnatural wasting of the body despite nourishment, bruises inconsistent with illness, and, most hauntingly, dreadful cries in the attic, persistent, nightly. These remarks, buried between routine accounts of laudanum doses and poultices, suggest that Dr. Willoughby witnessed far more than he ever admitted publicly. The contradiction is striking. On certificates, he affirmed natural decline. In his private book, he described conditions that defied simple explanation. Lydia Finch's death, for instance, was recorded officially as heart failure, yet his ledger entry for the same night reads: skin cold and damp, pulse erratic odors of opiate tincture, heavy in the chamber, bruising noted at the wrists. Family insists upon swift burial. He signed the official papers anyway, effectively silencing doubt. Whether this was done from loyalty, coercion, or fear remains the enduring question. Dr. Willoughby was known in the town as a quiet man, polite but distant. He attended parish services but never lingered for conversation. He kept a neat home and was rarely seen outside his rounds. Those who knew him remarked on his caution, never one to indulge in gossip, never one to contradict his wealthiest patients. Some saw this as prudence. Others whispered that it bordered on complicity. To many, his silence about the Finches became as much a part of the family's legend as the shuttered windows and locked rooms. The ledger suggests that silence did not come easily. On several occasions, he wrote of being disturbed by sounds within the house, unrelated to his patient calls. Moaning overhead while attending to Master H.F., sound not acknowledged by family members, or childlike sobs heard through wall, though nurse insisted no child resided in that room. These were not the notes of a man blind to horror, but of one deeply unsettled, struggling to reconcile professional duty with moral unease. Why, then, did he continue to sign their papers without question? One explanation lies in the Finches' influence. As benefactors of the parish and employers of many servants, their approval or disapproval could make or break reputations. A physician who defied them might quickly find himself without patients, or worse, accused of negligence. Another possibility is fear of something more personal. The ledger includes chilling phrases such as, "Family forbids thorough examination," and reminded sharply of my duty to discretion. These lines suggest he was warned, perhaps even threatened against recording too much truth. Some scholars who later studied the ledger argued that Dr. Willoughby was not complicit but trapped. His role forced him into close proximity with events he could neither explain nor expose. Signing the certificates may have been his way of surviving, of preserving his practice and safety, while keeping in his private pages some fragment of the truth. Others take a harsher view, that his silence allowed the Finch secrets to fester, that by lending his authority, he became part of the machinery that concealed whatever sickness, cruelty, or corruption plagued the household. The townspeople, for their part, remained divided. Some believed the doctor was simply discreet, honoring the privacy of a grieving family. Others suspected he knew far more than he let on. A blacksmith once remarked that he had seen the doctor leave the Finch gates pale and shaken, as though he had encountered something unholy within. Another villager remembered him pausing before signing a register at the parish, his pen hovering, his hand trembling before he forced the ink onto the page. In his later years, Dr. Willoughby grew reclusive. He gave up many of his village patients, attending only the Finches, and was rarely seen in the square. His health declined, though, whether from natural if the Finch family left little for the parish books to reveal, their servants carried the heaviest weight of memory. Maids, grooms, and tutors passed through the mansion's gates over the years, some staying only weeks, others enduring for months before quietly disappearing from the household staff. Many never spoke of what they witnessed, and when they did, their words were fragmented, whispered in fear, as though they might still be punished for breaking silence. The servants' testimonies, shaky, inconsistent, but disturbingly alike in detail, formed the backbone of the legend that would outlive the Finches themselves. One maid, who gave her recollections decades later when she was an old woman, recalled the house as one of constant secrecy. She described being told never to enter certain corridors, even for cleaning. Meals were carried to locked rooms, trays retrieved later with scarcely touched food. At night, she claimed, the household gathered in the great hall, not for ordinary prayer, but for something darker. They prayed at midnight, she whispered. Not the Lord's Prayer as we knew it, but words that made no sense, murmured together, like chanting. The maid insisted she heard the youngest daughter crying softly during these midnight gatherings, her sobs muffled under the weight of ritual. Other servants spoke of smells that clung to the air. One groom, who left after only 3 months of service, remembered a strong odor of sulfur drifting through the halls, particularly near the locked east wing. It burned the nose, he told a friend years later, like the fumes of brimstone. He swore that when he asked about it, a steward told him sharply it was from medicinal treatments. Though the groom had never seen a sick room, the smell persisted long after, seeping from beneath locked doors, leaving him convinced it was no medicine at all. Even the walls themselves seemed to participate in the concealment. Several maids reported that portraits of the Finch ancestors, once proudly displayed in the main hall, had been turned to face the wall. When asked why, one servant claimed she was told that the eyes of the paintings saw too much. She remembered dust settling thick on the backs of these heavy frames, the family refusing to have them cleaned or restored. The image of ancestors hidden from view, their stern gazes exiled into darkness, fed the notion that the Finches feared not just scandal but the judgment of their own bloodline. Some servants tried to speak while still in the village, but most found their warnings dismissed as gossip or malice. Those who pressed the matter further often left town altogether, as though even distance was not far enough from the Finch shadow. One laundress, dismissed abruptly, claimed she was followed in the streets at night by a man she recognized from the Finch household. He never spoke, she said, but his footsteps were always behind me, and I never dared to turn around. She moved 2 towns away and refused to speak the family's name again. The fear of retribution was real and enduring. Even decades later, when the house stood abandoned and overgrown, some former staff would only recount their experiences under conditions of anonymity. A stable boy, interviewed late in life, trembled as he recalled hearing screams from the attic, screams so piercing that the horses in the stables kicked against their stalls in panic. It wasn't sickness, he insisted, not the cry of someone ill. It was something being done to them. He refused to elaborate, only crossing himself and muttering that he should never have spoken at all. There were also accounts of strange gatherings. One footman claimed to have glimpsed the family arranged in a circle in the dining hall after midnight, candles lit though no feast was served. He saw objects on the table that he could not describe clearly, small boxes, perhaps, or jars that glowed faintly in the candlelight. When he was noticed, he was struck across the face by the butler and warned never to leave his quarters after sundown again. He left the household within weeks, shaken and unwilling to speak of what more he had seen. What gave weight to these scattered testimonies was their consistency. Each servant spoke of midnight rituals, of sulfur in the air, of portraits hidden, and screams from the upper rooms. None of them profited from their words. Most spoke reluctantly, often after long silences, as if confessing sins of their own. Their stories, taken together, painted a portrait of a household consumed by secrecy, its wealth used not to preserve comfort, but to build walls around whatever took place inside. Historians have argued over the meaning of these testimonies. Some believe the servants misinterpreted ordinary eccentricities, inflating oddities into horrors through fear and rumor. Others contend that the sheer number of consistent details cannot be dismissed so easily. What is clear is that those who lived and worked inside the Finch mansion carried away memories they could not shake, memories that left them unsettled even decades later, long after the family itself had gone to dust. The servants' voices, fractured though they were, became the only witnesses to the life behind the locked doors. They described a world of midnight chants, chemical fumes, and ancestors turned to face the wall, as if the house itself had become ashamed of its own legacy. They may never have known the full truth, but their fragmented accounts ensured that the secrets of the Finch family were never buried entirely. Even after the mansion was abandoned, the echoes of those testimonies lingered, a reminder that silence does not erase memory, and fear cannot fully conceal the shadows that once lived within. Cemeteries tell the stories families cannot hide. Names carved into stone, epitaphs chosen to preserve dignity, rows of markers forming a history more enduring than memory. Yet when one approaches the Finch family plot in the parish yard, the silence of those stones is louder than any sermon. Among the markers of merchants, ministers, and neighbors, the Finch graves stand apart, rows of granite and slate, bearing only initials and dates. The absence of full names, of scripture, of affectionate epitaphs, has puzzled every visitor since the last Finch was lowered into the ground in 1872. It is a burial ground that conceals as much as it reveals. The investigation into that cemetery plot began years after the house fell silent. Parishioners tending their own family graves noticed the oddity. Where others read, "beloved wife," or "devoted father," the Finch stones offered only the stark lettering, LF 1871, MF 1869, HF 1870. A few stones bore nothing but dates, some so weathered that only shadows of numbers remained. The austerity was jarring for a family of such means, whose wealth could have purchased marble monuments and elaborate inscriptions. Instead, the Finches chose anonymity, or perhaps erasure. The gravedigger, a man named Elias Carter, lived long enough to give his recollections of those years. He admitted that the Finch burials were unlike any others he had performed. Most funerals were conducted in daylight, with hymns, prayers, and processions. Finch burials, by contrast, often took place at dawn or deep in the night. "They'd call me after sundown," Carter told a neighbor decades later, "and order me to dig quick. Sometimes I dug by lantern, the family standing close by, watching." He was instructed never to linger, never to examine the coffins, and above all, never to ask questions. Payment was always immediate, always generous, and always accompanied by a warning glance. One story he repeated often was of a particularly small coffin, light enough to be carried under one arm. He remembered lowering it into the earth while a Finch servant stood by, his eyes fixed on the ground. When Carter asked softly whose child it was, the servant hissed, "Do not speak of it again," before shoving extra coin into his palm. The grave was marked only with a stone bearing the initials I.F., though no record of such a child exists in the parish books. Villagers who passed by the cemetery began to notice the strange growth of the Finch plot. Within a few short years, it had filled with stones far more quickly than any other family's section. Yet few could recall public funerals to account for the increase. It was as if they buried their dead in secret, one parishioner said, like they wanted the earth to swallow them without witness. The secrecy only fueled the legend that the Finches were concealing more than illness, that some deaths were never natural, and some burials were meant to erase rather than remember. The stones themselves became objects of fascination. Children dared one another to trace the initials at night, claiming that the letters felt unnaturally cold. Local women, tending their own family graves, whispered that they sometimes saw Finch family members visiting the plot long after dark, lanterns flickering as they stood in silence before the nameless markers. "They never prayed," one woman said. "They just stood there, like they were guarding the ground." The absence of epitaphs carried its own message. For Victorians, inscriptions were a vital part of memorialization. Even the poor found ways to carve verses or endearments into wood or stone. That the Finches, with their wealth, chose not to, is an omission too deliberate to dismiss. Some argued it was humility, a Puritan austerity carried into death. But others saw it as something darker, a deliberate erasure of names, as if those buried had something to hide or something the family wished hidden. Records confirm that several of the initials do not correspond neatly with known family members. Parish ledgers list no MF dying in 1869, nor an HF in 1870. Whether these were children never officially recorded, illegitimate offspring, or relatives erased from family memory remains uncertain. The mismatch between stone and scripture adds to the suspicion that the Finch graves were used not only for burial but for concealment. Carter, the gravedigger, recalled being ordered once to dig 2 adjacent graves in haste. He was told the bodies would arrive after midnight, and that he was not to return until dawn. When he came back, the graves were filled, the earth freshly tamped, and 2 plain stones had been set in place. No funeral had been held, no record entered in the parish book. To the town, those burials never existed, except for the stones themselves, mute and anonymous, standing in the Finch row. The unmarked graves became a source of dread for generations. Even after the estate was abandoned, villagers avoided walking past the Finch plot after sundown. They spoke of a heaviness in the air there, as if the ground itself resisted disturbance. When new caretakers of the cemetery attempted to clean or restore the stones, tools broke and workmen refused to continue. The initials, fading but still legible, seemed to anchor a mystery no one dared unravel. In the end, the Finch family plot became less a memorial than a puzzle, its stones a cipher of secrecy. Each blank epitaph, each pair of initials, each date carved without explanation, pointed to a lineage that chose silence over remembrance. Where other families filled the cemetery with stories of love and faith, the Finches filled theirs with omission, with absences that spoke louder than words. The unmarked graves are all that remain of their line. They stand today as weathered sentinels, reminders of lives lived in secrecy and deaths hurried into the earth. And though no epitaph explains their silence, the villagers who walk past them still whisper the same truth, that the ground itself holds the secrets the Finch family took with them to their graves. While parish records and servants' whispers offered only fragments, the cold precision of the courthouse preserved another strand of the Finch legacy. In dusty files bound with twine, the family's wealth and reputation were dragged into the light of law. What survives of these legal documents, inheritance disputes, contested wills, and depositions marked by sudden redactions, reveals a family at war with itself. Behind their facade of piety and discipline, the Finches were plagued by betrayals, accusations, and acts so troubling that even the record keepers dared not write them in full. The first dispute of note arose in the 1840s, when Henry Finch, the patriarch, sought to divide a portion of land between his sons. The case, Finch v. Finch, filled pages with bitterness. One son accused the other of gross mismanagement of family resources, alleging livestock sold without record and coin unaccounted for. The rebuttal was harsher still, charging cruelty toward younger siblings and acts unbefitting a Christian household. Neither side emerged untarnished, and though Henry's authority settled the matter in his favor, the bitterness lingered, feeding a rift that carried through generations. Later, as Henry's health declined, his will became the subject of fierce contest. The document itself, preserved in brittle ink, demonstrates the contradictions of the family. Generous gifts were promised to the parish and to distant cousins, while immediate heirs were treated with suspicion. One daughter received only a Bible and a stern note that she had failed in duty. Another son was cut off entirely, dismissed as unfit to bear the Finch name. When this will was read aloud in the courthouse, several heirs erupted into open protest. Witnesses recorded that the session devolved into shouts, with one Finch nephew declaring the patriarch mad with severity. The disputes did not end with Henry's death. Instead, the family's next generation carried the quarrels into the 1860s and 1870s. Surviving ledgers in the courthouse show repeated filings, siblings suing siblings, cousins challenging cousins, each accusing the other of concealing assets or squandering property. At least 3 suits involved allegations that family members withheld dowries from their sisters, effectively barring them from marriage and forcing them back into the estate. These women, nameless in most records, appear only in court transcripts as complainants, their pleas drowned by legal jargon. More troubling still are the depositions where whole passages were struck through with ink or blotted until illegible. Margins bear the notation, redacted, immoral matter. Historians studying these files have debated what those missing words might have contained. Some believe they referred to incestuous liaisons, rumors of which circulated long after the family's decline. Others argue they may have concealed testimony of violence, cruelty, or acts considered too scandalous for official record. Whatever the truth, the decision to blot them out indicates that the Finch disputes touched matters the court dared not place into permanent archive. The records also reveal the extraordinary lengths the Finches went to guard their wealth. In one case, an elder brother sought to prove his sister mentally unsound, thereby invalidating her inheritance claim. Testimony described her as melancholic, prone to solitude and silence, yet hardly incapacitated. Witnesses spoke of her reading scripture aloud with clarity, of managing household servants with competence. Yet the brother insisted she was unfit to manage resources, a charge that conveniently funneled her portion of the estate into his hands. Though the court ruled in his favor, the transcript betrays the cruelty of a family willing to sacrifice kin for coin. Patterns emerge in these disputes: charges of immorality, countercharges of cruelty, accusations of madness or waste. They form a chorus of betrayal, each Finch tearing at the others, bound together only by their shared secrecy. The more they fought in court, the more they revealed glimpses of their inner lives, yet never enough to provide clarity. Instead, the documents offer hints, half-told stories, and sudden silences where the most damning details should have been. The clerks who copied these records left their own marks of unease. One margin bears the faint note, "This matter not for public hearing." Another adds, "Details omitted by order of the magistrate." Such notations were rare, reserved only for cases involving obscenity or violence too shocking for community eyes. That the Finches' disputes warranted such treatment suggests that their secrets were darker than mere financial squabbles. For the villagers who caught whispers of these court cases, the image of the Finch family shifted from aloof benefactors to a clan consumed by suspicion. Word spread that brothers betrayed brothers, that daughters were denied their rightful inheritance, that wills were written and rewritten in bitterness. The townspeople saw only the fragments that leaked into gossip, but even those fragments painted a picture of corruption gnawing at the family from within. By the time the last Finch died in 1872, the courthouse files had already recorded the outline of their downfall. Wealth that might have secured their legacy instead became the weapon of their destruction. The depositions, with their redacted passages, remain the most tantalizing evidence of what truly transpired. Hints of immoral acts and betrayals that no judge dared set into ink. They remind us that the family's decline was not merely the result of illness or tragedy, but of deliberate cruelty and endless conflict. Thus, the court records stand today as a parallel cemetery, a paper graveyard of disputes and silences. Where the parish plot bears initials without names, the courthouse holds testimonies with words blotted out. Together, they preserve the outline of a family that tore itself apart, leaving behind not truth but fragments. And like the shuttered windows of their estate, those redacted lines remain locked, daring us to imagine the secrets they conceal. By the turn of the 20th century, the Finch estate no longer held a living soul. The once grand mansion, with its shuttered windows and locked corridors, stood in disrepair, its gardens overrun, its roof sagging under years of neglect. Yet though the family line had ended in 1872, their presence lingered in the minds of the villagers. The house itself became a character in local folklore, and the name Finch grew into a byword for secrecy, misfortune, and the kind of dread that seeps across generations. Children were the first to keep the legend alive. On long summer evenings, they dared each other to creep near the estate's rusting gates. Some swore they heard faint cries drifting from the upper windows, though no candle had burned there for decades. Others told of spectral figures glimpsed at the gate's shadows that moved when the moonlight shifted, sometimes tall like men, sometimes small like children. The braver ones swore that if you lingered too long, you might hear the creak of a carriage arriving on the gravel drive, though no horses pulled it and no driver sat at its front. By the time morning came, the tracks vanished, as though the earth itself had swallowed the evidence. Adults, too, carried the folklore, though their stories were cloaked in caution. Farmers returning late from their fields claimed to hear the sound of shutters banging, though no wind stirred. A widow, walking past the cemetery, reported hearing footsteps fall in rhythm with her own, only to find herself alone among the gravestones. The gravediggers' tales of nighttime burials became retold at taverns, growing more elaborate with each telling. Some insisted the Finches buried not only their dead but also their sins, planting both in the earth and marking them only with initials. The Finch name became a warning. Mothers told misbehaving children that if they did not behave, the Finches will come for you. Local merchants used it to explain misfortune. A failed harvest was a Finch curse, a house fire, a Finch fate. Even newcomers to the town quickly learned the story. Travelers passing through were pointed toward the estate as a curiosity, told to avoid it after sundown. Though the building was empty, its reputation remained potent enough to keep most villagers at a distance. Legends took on supernatural tones as the years passed. Some claimed that at midnight, the house lit up from within, as if every candle had been relit, and the silhouettes of the Finch family could be seen moving behind the nailed shutters. Others insisted that the cries of children echoed across the hedgerows, especially in winter, when the snow muffled every sound but those. Horses, it was said, refused to walk near the gates, balking and shivering as though sensing something unnatural. More curious still were the stories of voices. Travelers on the road late at night spoke of hearing prayers whispered from inside the house, not in English but in strange murmuring tones. A blacksmith swore he heard chanting in rhythm with the tolling of the church bell, though no one was inside the estate to speak them. These details linked back to the servants' old testimonies, ritual prayers at midnight, sulfur in the halls, and suggested that even in abandonment, the house replayed fragments of the life once lived within. The folklore grew so entrenched that the estate itself became part of the town's identity. School children drew pictures of it when asked to sketch a haunted house. Storytellers invoked its name in cautionary tales about pride, secrecy, and greed. Even those who doubted the supernatural acknowledged the Finches as symbols of misfortune. They represented what could happen when a family hid too much, when appearances were preserved at the cost of truth. By the early 1900s, the estate was a ruin. Weeds choked the garden, slates slipped from the roof, and animals nested in the chimneys. Yet no one dared to dismantle it for lumber or stone. One man who tried an outsider seeking salvage fell ill soon after, and swore he had heard voices cursing him as he pried at the shutters. He abandoned his tools and fled, leaving the mansion to collapse slowly under its own weight. Villagers interpreted his misfortune as proof that the Finch curse extended to anyone who disturbed their resting place. In time, the Finch estate became a landmark not for what it was, but for what it represented. Generations passed, but the legend persisted. Cries in the night, ghostly carriages, portraits turned against the wall. Each detail was retold, until it blended fact and fiction into one seamless tale. The family who had once stood as pillars of wealth and piety were remembered instead as keepers of shadows, their names synonymous with things best left unspoken. Even now, the Finch family survives only in fragments, initials on gravestones, redacted lines in court ledgers, whispered testimonies of servants, and the stories that still circulate in taverns and kitchens. Their house may be gone, its ruins overtaken by time, but the folklore remains rooted, as enduring as the stone foundations hidden beneath the ivy. For the villagers, the Finch legacy is not wealth, nor piety, nor even scandal. It is the warning that silence breeds shadows, and secrets, once buried, never truly rest. What remains of the Finch family is not a story told in full sentences, but in fragments, death certificates written in vague phrases, sealed rooms whose doors were never reopened, unmarked graves in the parish yard where initials stand in place of names. Their estate has crumbled into ruin, their bloodline has vanished from the town rolls, and yet their presence endures in silence. It is a silence woven from missing records, whispered testimonies, and the unease of a community that could never decide whether it had witnessed tragedy, cruelty, or something altogether darker. The official narrative tells us little. Certificates signed by Dr. Horace Willoughby speak of heart failure, fever, decline, and nothing more. Parish ledgers contain scratched-out entries, redacted notes, and baptisms without corresponding burials. In the cemetery, gravestones mark only the barest facts, initials, and dates, without epitaphs, as if the family feared memory itself. Each fragment feels like a deliberate erasure, a decision to withhold truth not only from neighbors, but from history itself. The physical remnants of the house reinforce the same impression. Visitors who stepped across its threshold spoke of locked wings and nailed windows, of portraits turned to the wall and corridors that led nowhere. The mansion became an architectural metaphor for the family's life, outwardly imposing, inwardly hollowed by secrecy. The sealed doors may have concealed madness, forbidden liaisons, or rituals whispered of by terrified servants. We cannot know. The locks still bar our way, long after the walls themselves have collapsed. And then, there are the testimonies, the only human voices that escape the family's suffocating silence. Servants spoke of midnight prayers in words that made no sense, of sulfur clinging to the air, of screams from the attic that were quickly hushed. A gravedigger remembered small coffins lowered into the earth at night, graves marked only with initials. Neighbors described children's faces staring from windows before being pulled back into shadow. These stories were never written into law or scripture, but they survived in memory, passed down in kitchens and taverns, repeated until they became legend. They may not be precise, but they are consistent enough to trouble the imagination. Were the Finches concealing madness that ran through their line? The redacted court records, with references to heirs declared unsound or unfit, suggest that some among them may have struggled with illnesses too shameful to admit. Or were they hiding crimes, acts of violence, abuse, or betrayal hinted at by bruises on the dead, cries overheard at night, or siblings accusing one another in court of immoral conduct? The most unsettling possibility is that the family pursued something ritualistic, a kind of private worship that twisted ordinary faith into secrecy and fear. The servants' testimonies of chanting and sulfur, the priest's reluctance to record details, and the villagers' belief that the house was haunted all point to practices that lay beyond mere eccentricity. Yet in the end, the truth was sealed away as carefully as the windows and corridors of the Finch mansion. Every artifact that survives offers only absence, initials without names, testimonies without full accounts, records with words blotted out. It is as though the family succeeded in their final wish to carry their story with them into the grave. What remains is not certainty but questions, questions that have outlived the house, the graves, and even the generation that whispered about them. The Finches remind us of the power of secrecy itself. In their time, they were masters of appearance, wealthy, pious, seated in the front pews of the parish, their donations ensuring silence. Yet behind that respectability lay shadows that could not be spoken of openly. Their downfall was not accompanied by scandal shouted in the newspapers, but by whispers that refused to die. That is their legacy, not the grandeur of their home, nor the wealth they amassed, but the unease they left behind. the unanswered questions that history still cannot silence. And so, the Finch family endures, not in the way they intended, but in fragments that invite speculation. Historians sift through ledgers, storytellers piece together rumors, and visitors to the old parish cemetery trace initials with their fingertips, wondering who lies beneath. What the Finches truly guarded, madness, crimes, or rituals, is something we will never know. But perhaps the greater truth lies not in what they concealed, but in what their concealment teaches us. That respectability can be a mask, that silence can weigh heavier than words, and that shadows thrive best in houses where doors are locked and windows nailed shut. Their legacy is silence, but it is a silence that still speaks. It warns us of the darkness that families may hide behind curtains drawn tight, of the secrets that wealth and piety can bury but not destroy. The Finch name has become synonymous not with prosperity but with misfortune, with the dread that comes when truth is deliberately denied. And though the last of them has long since turned to dust, the story of the Finches still lingers half fact, half folklore, a reminder that some families carry their secrets to the grave, leaving the rest of us to peer through the cracks and wonder what shadows once moved within.